Hello
Okay.
and welcome to Scale by Design. I'm your host, James Mackey, and today we are joined by Jason Weber. Jason, welcome to the show, man.
Good to see you, James.
Yeah, for sure. I'm pumped. I'm really excited to talk about biotech and synthetic biology. I've been doing my research so I can have a somewhat intelligent conversation with you today, get up to speed on the topic. It's absolutely amazing, and I'm so excited to learn more from you today. Before we jump into this topic, I was hoping that you could share a little bit about your background and experience of what you're doing today.
Sure. So I'm originally from the Midwest. Went to the University of Illinois, where I did a plethora of degrees: aerospace engineering, engineering physics, master's in nuclear engineering, and also an MBA, which is where I got my first stint into venture capital. Stepped away, did a fintech startup, and then kind of got lured back into VC, and that's where it took a turn towards biotech. So co-founded a family office VC in the Phoenix area back in 2014. Did a number of investments for the first few years, and then kind of got pushed into an operations role. Took over a fermentation facility we had in Oregon. Became managing director, in-licensed some tech out of Japan, developed some process, and then started doing CMO work, onboarding other startups to try and help them commercialize. And it's kind of where we are today.
I love it. So you've been focusing on biotech for, it sounds like, quite a while, right?
Better part of 8 years now. Okay,
cool. Yeah, that's really exciting. So I think, specifically we wanted to talk about applications of synthetic biology. I want to talk to you about that. Could you just give us like the high level on how synthetic biology has the potential to change the world, and how many different areas it has the ability to impact the way that we think about solutions, everything from like health to producing food to coming solutions to a ton of different problems. I would just love to get your sense on, all the future application, at least, from a high level.
Sure. So really where it starts is about being able to edit the genome effectively. So for like, I don't know, if you want to go back like 20 years, pretty much the only people that were doing stuff like this were pharmaceutical companies that had billion-dollar development budgets, just because of the time and intensity it took to do strain development and get something to work. But the tech has really accelerated things well in excess of Moore's law. And so the cost of editing genomes has dropped to pennies. So what used to take $1 billion budget, now you can have a couple kids out of grad school doing postdocs come up with a great idea and try and make a run to the market with it. So in that, with those cost reductions, just like back in the early IT days, where you needed to have rooms full of servers to set up a website. Now it's just like, you use Wix or one-on-one or something like that to do it in like 30 minutes. It's done. It's kind of similar with that. And so the venture capitalists followed suit, and like lots of it have been going in over the last few years, like almost 18 billion last year specifically. And I don't know if you saw, but there was a McKinsey Global Institute study that came out, I think last summer or the summer before that, where they expect by 2030, 2040 for the market of applications of synbio to go to like $2 to $4 trillion, which is kind of big. It's not a B, it's a T. And like 60% of all of the global physical inputs could be made with synthetic biology.
So when you say to like physical inputs, could you just explain to me what that means?
Oh God, it can be anything from biofuels, specialty chemicals, single cell proteins, replacement plastics for petrochemicals, or even maybe in fertilizers. That would be really cool if you could do stuff like that. Right.
For sure. So what industries do you think it's gonna, I mean, I know it's already out there making an impact to some extent, but like what industries do you think are gonna change the most as a result of synthetic biology in the next 10 years, 10, 20 years?
Honestly, I would hope that it changes pharmaceuticals the most. That's not really a space that I delve into a whole lot, and that's going to really need more than just synthetic biology, but it's going to require a lot of AI for developing those planes of potential solutions in a fast manner.
And
So
that's to solve things like cancer treatments and things of that nature, or
any disease or malady you can think of.
right.
There's always going to be a pathway, right? So a lot of that stuff's done with mammalian cell cultures now. Antibody responses to those, if those can be replicated recombinantly in an organism, I mean, that would be, and some of it is now, but if more of that can be done, that will certainly revolutionize pharma. But as for a lot of the other things, I think the main focus right now is on replacement of petrochemicals, right? So you don't have to use as many fossil fuels. So
Yeah.
that's the longer term development path. And right now it's just all the low hanging fruit, but eventually all those will go away and it'll be something a little harder.
Yeah.
That needs to be solved.
So I think one of the things that you touched on was utilization of AI and the relationship between AI, machine learning, and synthetic biology. From a little bit of research that I did, it sounds like we are still somewhat far out from being able to map that together in terms of there's apparently is a lot to do in terms of being able to track data sets and standardizing data sets to be able to pull insights together, useful insights from the AI. Do you know anything on that topic, or like how far along we are in utilizing machine learning with synthetic biology, or like what, there wasn't a ton of, from what I researched, it's not like there was a ton of papers on this exactly. I mean, people would talk about it high level, but there wasn't really a clear path to exactly saying like, hey, here's how many startups or companies or labs are really doing this right now.
Yeah, it's certainly become like one of the newer buzzwords.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people are doing synthetic biology. Okay, great. How do you differentiate yourself and what you're doing beyond everyone else? Oh, we use AI. Well, that's fine. But there are actually a few companies that have been doing AI for a long time. We actually did an investment into one of them, Zeta, which is computational biology focused, and they definitely do all kinds of machine learning AI in addition to their de novo protein design. So I'll always be really excited about them and their potential. So there are people doing it now.
And so what are like in the ways that AI is like currently impacting synthetic biology? Like what process, like what outcomes is it accelerating, or where is it giving the process like the biggest lift right now?
So all right, if you take a basic cell, we'll just to keep it simple, we'll say just yeast and you're making ethanol or something. This is probably a terrible example, but each pathway in there are proteins or enzymes that change whatever the input is into something else. And the hope with synthetic biology, or one of the big draws of a company like Zeta, is that computationally they can ignore the impact of evolutionary pressures, right? That gave us all the things that we have now. So all those evolutionary pressures selected against certain organisms because they just wouldn't make it, whether it be temperature or splitting under certain conditions or whatever. But there exists in a computational space all those things that have been selected and don't exist in nature, and they can be coded for now. And they may actually do things better in this like very confined environment of some aseptic fermentation where you don't have competitor bugs or anything, and you have controlled food sources and media, and it's like a Cabo resort for bacteria, right? Steady temperatures and everything is perfect there. So things develop a little differently, and so those things are possible now where they weren't before, and they could make whatever it is that the organism is trying to poop out and you're trying to sell more efficient. You can
Right.
get more for less input.
And so at the kind of crossroads of like synthetic bio and climate tech, isn't like one of the big drivers too? It's that you can there's a lot of application that's going to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. Like, do you know, are you aware of any of the things that are being done now to any technologies that are being developed to specifically tackle that problem?
So certainly decarbonization is like a big part of all of this on the climate tech side, right? So if you burn fossil fuels, you're emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. So the hope is if you have like certain processes that are anaerobic, that you're not going to give that CO2 molecule off. Ethanol production, whether it be beer, wine, or even fuel, does give off a CO2 molecule still, but there are other avenues of getting around that, so you can recapture that. And ultimately, if you have a pure source of CO2 coming off of that, I mean, there's other applications and capture that you can do for that aren't as readily available in a petrochemical process. I mean, industry is always working to change things, so maybe they'll find a way to catch up. But right now, that's one of the big draws.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And I know like one of the things, obviously due to all of the potential application, we are seeing a massive rise in funding. And I think that one of the bottlenecks we discussed is, how startups can actually go somewhere to produce and commercialize. I know that a lot of these experiments and such are happening in labs, but there's essentially limitations in bandwidth to actually commercialize at scale. I would like to learn a little bit from you on that topic. How do we go from like lab scale to actually producing at a much higher commercialized level? Could you walk us through that process of what needs to happen and then where the bottlenecks are, the challenges that need to be overcome for synthetic biology to thrive?
Yeah, so you've kind of touched on like the biggest soon to be emerging, well, it's emerging now, problem with synthetic biology is because these costs have gone down to make all of these new applications, the amount of funding's just exploded, right? Like it's basically been a doubling for every year for the last 3-4 years at this point. And like last year it was $18 billion. And half of that's like going into specific companies that are focusing on fermentation technology, right? So it's great in the beginning. It's real cheap to have a couple postdocs in a lab doing shake flask stuff. And then eventually you go into like a 2-liter fermenter and see if you can replicate things at scale, how it changes. But eventually you're going to have to like make a product and sell the product to people. And the economics of doing it in a shake flask are just impossible. So the main driver is always get larger and larger. And while VC is very happy to fund those moonshots early on because it's a good risk reward ratio, at some point when you get beyond say like 20 liters, and even 20 liters, there's not many startups that even have that capability, right? Because at that point you've got to have like steam sterilization and other chemicals and bigger autoclaves. And
How much does it cost to get to that level of production? I mean, can they still leverage other facilities, or I mean, are those facilities readily available that they can rent or lease? I mean, how does that process work? And what level of scale is actually required to commercialize? Like, I think just providing the audience with some context there so we know, like, kind of at what stage of the company's at this, do they have access to it? And, are they commercializing at this point, basically?
It's not a big deal to get like 2-liter and maybe 20-liter fermenters. 2-liter fermenters are like around 30-40 grand, right? And autoclaves and some ancillary stuff. So 100.
And is that enough to commercialize at all, or is that still testing?
So that's just going to give you probably enough to be able to do some rudimentary purification to get to a final product, and that depends on whatever product you're making. Hopefully, okay. So 2 situations. One, if you have a product that exists now and you're just making a bioequivalent, hopefully there's some specifications out there that you can lean on. It's like, this is the level of purity we need to hit so that we can actually do this at commercial scale. Can we do this effectively? The harder one is if it's a new product, say like a replacement meat or something, where there is no specification. So you got to work with the regulatory bodies to kind of figure that out. So much more complicated. Plenty of people are tackling that, but we stick to the ones where it's a known commodity. Say for example, we in-licensed a tech and had to develop the purification process. And we had a potential customer that's like, yeah, we want this. So we'd make it, and we would make our best attempt to purify it and send it to them. And they're like, not good enough, because they didn't send us a specification because it was too highly regarded secret internally. So like, try again. So, we shot for food grade the first time and made it, but that apparently wasn't good enough. So I'm like, let's just go, let's just do USP standards, US Pharmacopoeia. And we got there and sent it off to them. And they're like, still not good enough, but close enough that we will now share with you our specification. So then we made further changes and hit it. And then, the big order comes through is like, we'll buy all you can make. Well, we can't make anything unless you give us a contract, because there's a lot of capital that goes involved with that sort of thing. So most of this stuff was done up through 1,500 liter scale, which is still pretty small, right? And there, even though there wasn't a whole lot of that stuff floating around, there's like a number of universities that are jumping on the bio bandwagon and are opening these kind of like piloting facilities up through like 1,000 liters. So it's a lot more common now, easier to do, not a whole lot of expense, but some of them are even getting better at having like a big component of the downstream processing or purification process too involved there. But once you start getting around 10,000 liters and you're down to like a handful of places in North America that can even touch it, and generally they don't have the downstream purification. So
and by downstream purification, like that, just, I mean, they just lack the physical technology in order to do that.
Right, the unit operation. So say like in the case of an amino acid, you'd have a fermentation, then you'd have a centrifuge to separate out the cells, and then you might do like an activated carbon and then a crystallization step, and then if it's heat sensitive, you might do a vacuum drying step as well on top of that. So like the fermentation facility is just going to have fermentation and the cell separation, and then you got this broth that you've got to send someplace. And that broth is generally dilute, so maybe it needs to be concentrated up before you can actually crystallize it, or the activated carbon to remove some impurities. Maybe it's harder and you need to actually do something like an ion exchange or chromatography system to get where you need to be. But you could be going to 3 or 4 different sites.
Okay, so it's 3. So from a business perspective, it's like doing the transportation is like a logistical nightmare, and probably obviously increase cost of production significantly. So I mean, the unit economics of that sounds like they would just be like hemorrhaging cash. Like it's not a sustainable model without like a ton of funding. And then it's like you get to what you're saying is like a commercial scale, which is what we discussed, like 150,000 liters or more. To actually commercialize a lot of these chemicals that are being produced. And that's where there's really a production shortfall. You said like there's hardly, I mean, is like, where would companies go to produce this? Is there like, how many options do they have for that?
There's really like a handful globally outside of China, and there's like 3 or 4 in Europe.
Okay.
There's some places, if you really intend on going to very large scale, like feed proteins, there are people that'll entertain it, but generally they want to be involved in the production. If they bring you in to do that anyway, they just don't want you to come in and then leave. So between this 15,000 and 150,000 liter scale, there's really not many options in North America, which is going to make it a day of reckoning for the venture capital industry, maybe in 3-4 years.
So what you're
So
saying is like these startups are going to scale to the point where they're ready to commercialize, but then they're not going to have production facilities available to actually commercialize.
yeah,
But can't they just like pay these production facilities? I mean, isn't it like anything else, right? Like they just lease space in a production facility to do this. And
sure. But like right now, everyone's pretty much running at capacity and you got a 6-month backlog now. And this is before a lot of those companies even make it out of the lab and into the larger scales. So in 2 to 3 years, it's going to compound. So like at the facility we had, we did inbound tech transfer a number of processes, and we were familiar with how much time they needed to run for their given process based on, and you could equivalent that to whether they were seed, series A, series B, series C, something like that. So like you take a number of them, you do an average, and then you go on PitchBook and you pull out all the deal flow at those different stages, and you can kind of track, given standard success failure ratios at each stage, how much capacity is going to be needed in industry. And when I did that math, I came out with like 5 million liters in the next 5 years as a shortfall. And that's not like the entirety. If you talk to people like Chris Gusky and Mark Warner and a few others, they're going to say it's like much bigger than that, an order of magnitude larger, and the amount. But they're also including like food proteins, which is huge. And I would say it's not quite fuel commodity level, but it's certainly the margins on it are lower. So, for me, if you're off by an order of magnitude on something where you're making pennies on a product, it's, in my opinion, not like the first thing that I would go after. So I tend to try and stick to specialty chemical small molecule applications rather than the multi-billion-dollar market applications of like cultivated meat or stuff like that. So I'm talking just in this range. That's what I think the shortfall is going to be.
Well, so then how does startups compete? Like, so for VCs that want to invest in synthetic biology startups, and they're thinking about whether it be kind of like a supply chain issue or a production problem at scale, are there certain ways that some startups can have an advantage over others here, like in terms of like the types of fermentation process that needs to be produced, or the length, or like which, or I don't know. I mean, something else. Like, is there some areas within synthetic biology that are going to have an advantage considering this bottleneck, or how to start, investors, early stage investors pick winners here to deal with this problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that people always, and especially in VC, always push for is partnerships with like larger strategic companies that can handle some of that production so they don't have to. But I think honestly, some of the other selective pressures are kind of like evolutionary. So horrible example, but let's imagine you got a pool that's too deep, and you've got 100 people in there, and left to their own devices, basically everyone get VC funding and they float. Now you go and you tie 1 kilogram sandbag on everyone's foot. There's going to be some that will not be able to still swim. Now, if you double it again to 2, there's gonna be a lot more that can't swim. And so the VC's hope is the best will always survive and get the scarce resources. In my thinking, there's like a lot of those people that would drown with the 1 kilogram weight that could easily make lots of money for the VCs that are getting cut out because they're not going to be able to compete with like the Impossible Foods, the Memphis Meats, or there's a lot of companies.
And that's specifically because of the cost of the fermentation process. Like because of that bottleneck, like they're basically, they're dying out before they really have the opportunity to be successful because they can't actually go to market.
It's harder for them to go to market because it's not as attractive to a VC to invest in somebody who's got a sub-billion-dollar market potential, like right off the bat or fairly quickly, right? So those that are in like the 200 million to 800 million range just aren't going to get the same amount of love. So they've got to really do bootstrapping, and you've got to have a really talented team to be able to do all this remotely, and then line up the CMO production capacity too, and still make money, right? Because the story isn't as compelling to as someone's like, oh, as a spreadsheet has billions of dollars in it, so I want to do that.
Right. And there's a lot of these concepts. Like, what can you give us an example of some of the solutions that could be developed that maybe are like, companies that could easily be valued at in the hundreds of millions, but maybe not the multi-billion-dollar application? Like, can we get a couple examples of what those businesses would be?
Yeah, so one of the companies that I really like, and we've done a small seed investment in them, is Callian. So they have a glucaric salt that they make that has unique properties that, well, has a number of product applications in different tiers, but one of the unique things is that it acts like a anti-scaling or a corrosion inhibitor in cooling tower water. That may sound rare, but like even if you go by a data center, there's generally cooling towers to keep things cool, right? Because evaporation is still pretty efficient for heat removal. So existing cooling tower amendments are generally phosphate based, and there is a definite push to eliminate those in the future. And so there's not a viable alternative except for this. So right now that market is nowhere near $1 billion, but maybe in 10 years it could evolve to be that, with some regulatory incentive. But even by itself, it'll eventually get there. But immediately, no. And so it's just not as sexy for some VCs to look at, even though there's definite market applications and there are strategic buyers who want it. And so it's really kind of threading that needle. And I think they're going to make it. So I've seen the process up close and personal, and I'm a true believer in them. So,
Sure.
but their struggle in this intermediate scale of like, we need to do runs at 100,000 liters. Where can we do that quickly and cheaply to continue to build out the market? Because the buyer is always going to. So this is another like rarely talked about problem is a strategic buyer will generally qualify the process at a specific scale at a specific facility. So just because you can make it in Oregon doesn't mean that they're going to buy the same stuff that you're making in Europe, because everything is different. So they have to go through the whole qualification process all over again. So that makes jumping around, right, kind of like an on-demand sort of a gig economy for contract manufacturing, like really hard to do. So lots of struggles, but that like 5 million liter shortfall turns out to be like 16 plus facilities at this scale. So, and some people will like wave the magic wand of like, oh, we just need one huge facility. It's like, that doesn't solve the problem, because if you have one huge facility, everything is to get dedicated and you tend to go larger scale. And really it's like, you need lots of these 15,000 or 30,000 liter or 150,000 liter fermenters. You don't need like 300,000 liter fermenters, because you're going to run for like one run a year and then you're idle the rest of the time. So a natural evolution that we thought of was like, okay, you got this facility that's in this scale. Like, why run as a CMO at all? Why not just like make it a venture operation? Because, margins for CMO are not like spectacular. Of course, they're going to get better as the market gets tighter.
And when you say CMO though, like I want to tell the audience what you mean by that, just to make sure everybody.
Contract manufacturing organization.
Okay.
Right. So someone that you pay to run your process, in the way that I talk about it, is typically for fermentation and downstream processing. Although those typically happen at different locations, but if you had one of these places that could take care of it, I think it's a better idea than rather than have one customer or run for a month and then be idle for 11 months, which never makes economic sense. And then in year 2, they run for 2 months at some scale, and 4 months, and the slow progression of making market penetration on a new product. Why not just have a venture fund and just like try to bring like 4 to 6 of these startups through a year? And
Right.
as they get to that next scale, you put them into bigger tanks, and they save time and money, because one of the biggest things that you do, thank you, is you're constantly out raising money as a startup, right? And if you don't know how much it's going to cost, because you don't know how long it's going to take for you to get through these runs, you're really not spending the time building a business, right?
So like, I guess my question is, right, like these production facilities are needed. There's a huge bottleneck here that's going to become more and more evident over the following years.
Yeah.
We're probably going to see viable startups start to fail at an even greater rate because they're bottleneck and ultimately run out of cash. At least that would be my prediction. And so in terms of creating more production facilities, I think you mentioned on average, these facilities cost 65 million-ish to start. Did I remember that number right? Or
Yeah, that's about what ours cost. So like any of those similar in scale, which is I think what really is needed in North America specifically, you're anywhere 40 to 80 million, depending on what kind of purification you need.
So, I mean, I think like, particularly given all the opportunities for failure, working with different vendors and providers and considering the shortfall, it would seem like, obviously it would be ideal to own one of these production facilities. But then the issue becomes, as you said, if it's not in a specific industry or the specific application, is it going to reach a valuation above $1 billion? Then VCs may not be willing to make the investment into the startup to build the facility unless they see like a multi-billion-dollar play. So how do you see the future playing out in the next 5 years? Do you see next 5 to 10 years? Do you see, independent companies building more production facilities because they're looking at this bottleneck and they see that as a good business venture? Do you see the cost of developing a production facility going down so it's more accessible to startups? Like, how do you see this kind of evolving past the bottleneck it is today? Like, what's the path out of it?
So there's never one answer for anything, and there should always be multiple answers.
Wait, you don't have like one easy answer to solve this incredibly complex question?
And if anyone has a single answer to anything, run away, because they're overlooking a lot of other avenues to doing things. So venture is waking up that this is a problem. There's lots of paper studies on, like think tanks trying to analyze it and come up with a solution. The government, I think, threw like close to $1 billion in the Inflation Recovery Act to stopping inflation by spending more money doesn't make sense. Anyway, but certainly they've identified a need of a shortfall of this fermentation capacity. Now, how that money gets allocated or spent, I don't know. But there are a number of startups that are, that are working on this. Mark Warner Liberation Labs. There's another interesting startup called Synonym that just raised a seed round of a few $1 million. And their idea is to kind of try and marry this investment banking function with some of the startups and facilities to kind of bridge that gap. They've just started, so it'll be really interesting to track their progress over
What's it called?
Synonym.
Yeah, I just pulled them up on Google because I was looking at like just trying to Google some articles and they were like the first thing to show up. So like, what exactly are they do? It looks like they're a financer though. Like but it says development platform too. Like what the heck?
Yeah, they're trying to marry some of the investment banking function that you would have at like kind of more mature startups, right? They might use an investment bank to raise a large round. I think that's a lot less common now than it was, say, like 5 years ago. But you marry that, and the one of the other problems that a lot of these startups have is, they've got lab people, but running the engineering processes and determining like what equipment you need and how big it needs to be really is a whole different skill set that can't really, at least I don't think it can be solved by just like one person being added to a company to be
Yeah.
able to see something. It's like a whole team of experts in and of itself. So they also focus on the engineering side of giving true determination, because they have some great experts, some former merit people involved with the company too, that really know their stuff, and really trying to give you an actual number of how much it's going to cost to build something, and then
Right.
bringing together the investors via the investment banking function that can execute to build a right size facility for a single. So that's great. And that's, those are two prongs that you can have to help solve the problem. Government funding being a third prong, which is obviously going to happen no matter what. But there's still the gap for the smaller ones, right? So those groups are generally going to look at larger, bigger dollar things rather than the smaller ones. Maybe they'll do a couple smaller ones initially when they just to start, but longer term, they're going to, go for the bigger companies with the bigger markets.
So that sounds like in a sense pretty typical in that, first off with new technology, it's more expensive, right? And it kind of cuts people out of the market. And then as we build up, it sounds like in this case, not only better technology possibly, but just more infrastructure, like just more physical infrastructure to do this process, that it will potentially open up the market to, startups that might not have that multi-billion dollar application currently.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a safe assumption? Like over time, this bottleneck is going to dissipate just based on infrastructure continuing to grow as like this becomes, there's more and more application for synthetic biology. Is that a safe assumption, or what do you think?
Yeah, eventually there'll come a point where there'll be enough attrition and enough people building stuff, but it's like predator prey model, and there's definitely a huge lag in on the predation side, right?
For sure.
Yeah, so a lot of good companies are going to just not be around by the time some of that capacity comes online. So I don't know that we'll be able to catch up.
Yeah.
On the capacity.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like obviously VCs want to be the first solution to the table in order to win,
Yeah.
but it's like, when do you shoot your shot, and is it too soon based on this bottleneck?
Yeah,
For some of these companies, right?
it's so funny because in a way, VCs know. So like one solution to this problem that's been tried, and there's like a number of failures that I didn't even send you that slide of all the people that tried to build a singular plant to do that product and hope they could make it to market. And like there's like almost a dozen failures in the industry of people blowing like $50 to $100 million to build one of these facilities, and the market dynamics changed or something. So rightfully so, VCs are scared shitless to like invest in something that's going to do that. So
Yeah.
but their portfolio risk is to dump money into a lot of different startups and hope that they pick some of the winners. So why wouldn't you just apply that to CapEx too? If you have one facility, don't just have one person go through there, have a bunch of the startups go through there, and you
Right.
mitigate your risk.
Yeah, I mean, it's like either having a strong partnership in place with the facility, those relationships, or possibly this wouldn't be traditional VC in a sense, but yeah, you're right. Like owning some kind of facility and then creating an accelerator to pump startups through that, could be, another option, right?
Yeah. I think we're at the leading edge. In 2 or 3 years, people are going to figure this out and they'll catch up. But like right now, they're still just trying to find ways around it because it's not become acutely problematic, like, hey, we have this killer startup that should just be destroying the market, and we can't find production, so they're going to go bankrupt. Like, oh man, we did something wrong. So like, so all right, so VC is not into it right now. Who else is there? Private equity is really the only other ones, right? They're more known for like very late stage and revenue generating, but their risk appetite is starting to creep down in
Yeah, but
towards more
also
of the
like
venture side.
they're looking at unit economics and looking at like path to profitability and stability. And it's like, they might be interested in like later stage growth equity or, stuff like that. But I mean, it seems like the risk, like if VCs are scared of like the risk, I feel like PEs are going to be, yeah, I don't know. I mean, unless
More
there's a
scared.
very, yeah,
Yes.
not until like they've been able to prove out any kind of realistic path to profitability. And if there's a $65 million problem between startup and profitability, or at least even commercializing,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a significant hurdle. I actually I have one question for you, if it's cool. I just because we're coming up on time. I wanted to ask you, what about like if you can demonstrate like a successful product, right? Not at scale, but you've been able to use synthetic biology to influence a change to have an application that could be commercialized. Could you then sell that to an enterprise company that does have access to production and distribution, and basically sell that proprietary technology that you've developed? Is that like one avenue for these startups to exit without having to deal with a production bottleneck?
Yep, absolutely. And that's a number of companies' general business model is to do out licensing of the tech. Sometimes what you will see is a startup that will, they're coming into it. They know they can't. They know what they don't know, or they know that they don't know what they don't know, and so they want to license this stuff out rather than build facilities or trying to do all the marketing side of some big product. So they'll make a partnership. They'll get a lot of non-dilutive capital, and there'll be some milestones, and at the end of 2 years or so, there's a sweetheart deal for whoever the strategic is that gave them all the non-dilutive capital. And so they hit all the milestones, and they high five each other and like, let's go on and do the next product. So they go back out in the market and try and raise more capital at a higher valuation. Like, okay, where's the progress that you did? It's like, well, we did all this stuff. Yeah, but you just gave the license away and all the value that the company generated to that company that you got this non-dilutive capital for. So no, we're not giving you a higher valuation. And so some of them flame out.
Yeah.
Captive audience. It's also very dangerous.
Yeah, I think like, one of the, I mean, tell me if this is dumb, because I would, I obviously don't know this space, but like, I think one of the things is like, if you're well connected in the production and distribution network, right? Specifically for this, or you at least have LPs, like limited partners in your fund that are, then it's like your whole fund strategy is like creating this flywheel of early stage, synthetic bio companies that literally you are coming in at like maybe like a pre-seed round, helping design like, hey, what's really cool, like, application or something that, what's a really cool, something that you can create. Let me help you with the go-to-market strategy and help you figure out how to commercialize that, or at least prep it for commercialize to show that path forward. And then I'm going to leverage my partnerships and get you, to help us exit before we hit, so you're not actually, the goal isn't to produce. And so it's maybe not these sweetheart deals, but it's still like tapping into existing relationships to find a successful exit. I mean, are we seeing VCs like do that consistently as like a fund investment thesis or fund strategy?
If it's out there, and I could have missed it, right? Because I've been playing more on the ops side of scale up for a little bit now. But one of the big overlooked problems is, for the most part, fermentation is pretty standard there's like certain amounts of sugar and certain amount of air and other things that go into it, and you make stuff and you remove the cells. Oh, hopefully the product isn't in the cells because that's more complicated, but people do that all the time too. But for every product, it's pretty much a bespoke solution on purification. So like even like in amino acids, like alanine purification is not the same as valine purification, is not the same as threonine purification. And they all basically use crystallization active carbon, active carbon and vacuum drying for the products. But they're all different settings in every one of them, because now you're doing a biological process as opposed to however it was done before. I think alanine was done enzymatically, enzymatic reaction from aspartic acid or something like that before. So all that process has to be developed, and it's really hard to guess at the economics until you do it, right? And that just takes time and money.
So what you're saying is all these different like companies could have very different unit economics, even though it's like just based on the is accurate to say the fermentation process or how you're going about what like where the products, right?
Yeah. We did a couple products internally. One we in-licensed, one we developed in-house, and the one we developed in-house was a carotenoid. And so that was something that was produced inside the cell. So then you've got to lyse the cell, break the cell wall so that you can extract it. And you know, it's a complicated extraction process. We use supercritical CO2, but we weren't getting the extraction efficiency that we thought for the product. So then we had to go back and redevelop like the homogenation to lyse the cell so that we could get the product out, because it wasn't, the economics weren't going to work out if we did it half-assed like it was, right?
Yeah, so it's basically, that's another really, and I'm sure that scares VCs and investors in general as well, because it's like the production costs can be so drastically different. You know, I think it's really interesting is that like, you know, most VCs are not scientists with PhDs in biology. You know,
a lot of them are now, but you know, a PhD is just like an over specialization. So once you get outside of a set of what you've done, I mean,
yeah, it's like how beneficial. I mean, I feel like you need to have a high level of expertise to pick winners here. And even when you do have a high level of expertise, like as you said, it's like you still can't necessarily predict unit economics or path to profitability or like what issues you're going to have when trying to develop you know, a product here. I mean, it sounds like it's you know, there's just so many areas and it's just so complex that I mean, I would say like this is probably why we're seeing more funds that are specializing in biotech or syntech, or excuse me, synbio, because we're seeing like the level of specialization required in order to pick effective winners. Like if you're a generalist VC and you're just playing around saying, hey, like, you know, this is a growing sector, let's dump some money into this. Like I don't see how they could possibly pick a winner effectively without just getting lucky, unless you have a high level of expertise here.
Yeah, over a decade ago, there were a number of those big powered VCs. I won't name some of the names so that they can remain unknown right now, but they were more general, focused on the tech side, and they got into bio and were throwing tons of money at it and really did not understand the costs of commercialization. And eventually they said, we're out, and left a lot of companies high and dry. So, and maybe rightfully so, right? Because they were throwing good money after bad and didn't really have that the unit economics where they were today and where they could realistically get to soon enough. So
do you think, and I know we're running, do you have a couple extra minutes? I going a little bit over. Okay. Do you think the way that VCs are investing in synbio, biotech, climate tech, are we as the VC community doing proper due diligence in these deals? Or do you think they just see like, oh, you know, synbio, this is the future, right? Like this is going to change the world. This is the next kind of revolution, right? This is going to be like the most important shift we see in our lifetime. And so we want to get in with as many companies as we can. I'm just curious the level of due diligence and expertise that you think is going into funding right now with this huge spike in funding that we're seeing.
So it's a double-edged sword. I mean, if you ask them, they're definitely doing it the right way, right? But if you ask others, I mean, like if it's really outside of their scope, they'll bring in a subject matter expert, some PhD. They'll come in as a consultant and go visit the site and look at the lab and watch some fermentation runs, and they'll get a journal. It's like, oh, it looks like it's working, and yes, I validated this on the HPLC. But do they really understand the entirety of the process? Because honestly, we've had a number of people come through the plant, and it was all lip service on purification. Oh yeah, we have a process. We're going to do this step, and this step, and we're going to have a product. Like, okay, well, what are the specifications on any equipment that you're going to do for that? Well, we haven't done those tests. Well, you don't have a process then, right? You can get, most of them can get through to fermentation, which is like it's really the big hurdle. But after that, it's just kind of an assumption that if it's similar to another process, it'll work the same. And I've certainly seen some CBD companies come through with a soup of CBDs, and they're just so chemically similar that you can't even separate them with chromatography. And so they're just hopeless. They'll never make it. They need to send the product back up to the strain engineers to get rid of the side products. So I don't know. It's tough, and they raise some money, but it's like an afternoon. Like, hey, this is not going to work.
Right.
It was like a couple days of thinking, but gut reactions generally pretty good.
Gotcha. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you for walking me through this and our audience through this topic. I really enjoyed this. We covered a lot of high level what's happening in the industry, as well as we got very technical. So I appreciate you doing that with me today. And Jason, I just want to say thank you for joining us on the show. I know a lot of investors listening into this essentially just got a masterclass on fermentation and the process to bring these products to market. And I know that's going to be super helpful, as well as for founders considering building products in this space. So thanks so much, man. I hope you had fun on the show with me as well.
I did. I want to leave you with one thing. So there's a saying in science that science progresses only at the speed of which the previous generation dies off, that are kind of locked into the previous box of what's real and what's not real. I think the same thing is probably true with financiers, and that as the older generation dies off, those that are open to new funding models will take their place, and progress will continue.
I love it. And Jason, for people that want to engage with you, maybe your firm or you directly, what's the best way that they can find you?
LinkedIn is always easiest. I can give an email, but it gets kind of tricky over that. It's jason@scvco.com, but LinkedIn is probably the primary.
And everybody listening, we're going to put Jason's LinkedIn profile at the bottom of the episode description so you can find it there. All right, man. Well, thank you again. And for everybody tuning in, thank you for joining us, and I will see you next time. Take care.